I'd like to thank John Crowley and Diane and everybody here at Aquas Cafe and Aquas Community. And also want to make sure that we also recognize and thank all the people in the kitchen and behind the bar. Maria, Katie, Amy left. But thanks to all of you. And thanks to Petaluma Community Access, PCA, Mark and Michael here, and also thanks to Sam. So we'll have video coverage here. This is the Project Censored lecture series. It's every second Tuesday, so we actually had this planned much further in advance than the Democratic Party, who decided to finally have a debate this evening, and that's probably where some people are. So we're actually going to talk about some around that issue, which is, of course, media coverage and the dog and pony show of the two-party system, and basically what's not covered and what's left out. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm Mickey Huff, the director of Project Censored. Project Censored was founded in 1976 by Carl Jensen at Sonoma State University. And we're here this evening to talk about our new book, which is Censored 2016, Media Freedom on the Line, that I edited with Dr. Andy Lee Roth, our associate director, and we put together with the team at Project Censored. This is our, again, 39th year. We were founded in 1976, and our crew this year consisted of about 191 students and 31 professors on 18 colleges and universities around the United States. So we have branched out certainly further than Sonoma State University, though our former director, Peter Phillips, who's going to be speaking here with us this evening, he's still at Sonoma State University, and there's still a class there. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk about that work. And even though Project Censored is known for covering the top 25 stories every year, right, that the corporate media should have talked about but didn't, we don't just talk about the censored or underreported stories that are negative. We also talk about stories that are good news stories, because the corporate media don't really want us to have a sense of community and solidarity either around a lot of those issues. And we do way more than just the top 25, though you can certainly see those online at projectcensored.org, dating back to 1976, including the new book. But there are numerous chapters in all of our books that cover things like junk food news, news abuse, media democracy in action, and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in the book, and because it's not just the top stories. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a couple of our student researchers. Stephen Farrar is here from San Francisco State University. I'm also going to bring up Crystal Bedford, who was a student with us at Diablo Valley College and ran the Project Censored Club there. She's now at UC Davis. So she's going to come up and talk about a lot of work that she did. In fact, she and several other of our student interns this past year did an article that you can see online on our main page on women in media and how women are covered in media, or how women's issues are censored in media. So, our students do a lot of great work, and that's what we're celebrating. We're celebrating our student work, we're celebrating media literacy, we're celebrating critical thinking, and we're also celebrating the great independent journalists that write these stories that the corporate news media won't cover. So, let me start by simply saying, I want to reiterate that our book is dedicated this year to Carl Jensen, who was the founder of the project. Carl passed away in April. And so in the dedication, we have an inscription for Carl that says, "A self-described optimist by birth and tireless champion for the bonds between freedom of expression and democracy, Carl Jensen promoted critical media literacy and the training of ethical journalists as ways to cultivate more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers. He taught investigative journalism as a way to solve social problems and improve people's lives." And we continue to do that in Carl's name, and Peter did that for some 14 years as director, and I've been director for about 5 years. And we're coming up on our 40th anniversary, where we're celebrating the growth of the project and something called the Global Critical Media Literacy Project for media education, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as the evening goes on. As I mentioned before, this is the same, tonight is the night of the first Democratic debate, the one that the Democratic National Committee wouldn't really decide on having and who was going to be invited, and then once they did, they basically disinvited or uninvited the number 2 person at the DNC because they criticized the fact that they weren't having enough debates and they weren't including enough people. So one might wonder then how democratic is the Democratic Party. And the corporate media, of course, kind of goes along with all of this, right? And we've covered numerous stories on debates and elections and so on over the years. How many people here know that the Commission on Presidential Debates is a for-profit private corporation run by equal number of Democrats and Republicans? Couple people, only 2 people, 3 people, that's it. Used to be run by the League of Women Voters, right? And because the candidates of the 2 major corporate parties were not happy about the fact that they had to face actual journalists and possibly real questions, so they started negotiating and saying, well, we're just not going to go, or we're not going to show up if these people are going to ask these questions. And that's when the process was taken away and privatized, and now Open Secrets, various government organizations, various nonprofits that look at government practices. There were leaked documents that show that now the debates are not only totally privatized and for profit, but the candidates get to decide ahead of time who's going to be there, who's going to be the moderators, what questions they will and won't ask. But that's never really disclosed to the public. These documents were leaked years ago. So this evening, a lot of people are probably tuning in to what's going on there. I just want to reiterate the frame of that, right? The frame of this evening that the media is giving us is the leading candidate is allegedly Hillary Clinton, with Bernie, he can't be elected, Sanders. And then there's a few other people that most people don't even know are running. Lawrence Lessig was not invited to the debate, and the argument is, well, he's not polling enough, but of course he's not part of the questionnaires that comprise the polls. Right, and everybody knows, anybody who knows Lessig knows that his main issue, in fact, he even said that if he's elected, this is his main goal, is to overturn Citizens United, get corporate money out of politics, and he would resign. So one doesn't need to wonder a lot why corporate news media isn't terribly interested in Lawrence Lessig's campaign. And the Democratic National Committee, along with their Republican counterparts that are dominated by corporate money, they're obviously not interested in that message. So these are just some of the things that are left out of the corporate news media. And we're glad that some of you came out here this evening to hear us talk about what some of the major stories that were censored last year, and hear from some of the people that contributed to the book. And of course, later in the evening, we'll also have Christopher Oscar, one of the filmmakers with Doug Hecker of Project Censored the Movie, talking about some of our new student film projects. And Peter Phillips will talk about his chapter. For the last several years, he's been doing a lot of research on the transnational capitalist class. And this year, he contributed a chapter on private mercenary armies, which is quite riveting and disturbing. So we'll do this for probably about 30 some odd minutes, and then we're just going to open things up and have a conversation. So again, thanks everybody for coming. We appreciate you all being here. You'll see here I'm holding our last book, Censored 2015, and I had a foreword by Ralph Nader. So I want to share a thought that Ralph added in this book, and then I want to share another thought that former FCC Commissioner Nick Johnson has in our new book, Forward, because I think they're ever timely. And in fact, Nader's quip in the foreword of the 2015 book here, Inspiring We the People, it's very relevant to the presidential process, the debates process, and how corporate media get to decide, essentially, who's the winnable candidate, right? And we're seeing that unfold right now. Well, Ralph says here, establishment reporters will wallow in a rut of self-restraint or boredom and wait for gaffes, and when third-party candidates or citizens point out crucial questions that should be asked, including why candidates unreasonably restrict access by reporters. So indeed, after explaining the newsworthiness of his own campaign in 2008, he asked Washington Post editor Fred Hyatt why there was almost no coverage of Nader's ongoing campaign in his newspaper, in the Washington Post. And Nader campaigned in Washington, D.C. and highlighted the city's pressing issues that other major candidates were not touching. And Fred Hyatt blurted out, he said, "Because you can't win." Nader replied, "Well, then why are you covering daily the Washington Nationals baseball team?" Which wasn't winning many games either. And of course, Hyatt smiled, and when the media accept the game as the two major parties want it played, whole segments of the society and their needs are blacked out from ever being discussed. And of course, we discuss these issues in our book every year. Peter and I discuss it on KPFA on our radio show every week that's on 30 cities now. And we really need critical community media that delivers these kind of issues to the public. And in fact, no matter what your primary concern is, this is getting to Nick Johnson, the FCC commissioner, who's been a Project Censored judge since 1976. He wrote years ago in a book called Second Priorities that he basically said that no matter what your primary objective is, no matter what your primary concern, your primary issue, what you seem to care about the most, if your second issue of concern or interest isn't media, you're unlikely to make much progress or much ground in your primary area of interest, because you aren't breaking in. You're not breaking into the community. You're not breaking into the society. You're not breaking into the public. So Project Censored celebrates independent journalism and tries to catapult and highlight what we find to be the top stories of the previous year. And we think that they're very newsworthy. We think that newsrooms should, instead of hyping up trumped up concerns about the non-existent Ebola threat, instead of worrying about things like Deflategate or what Kim Kardashian is doing, we think that on those news days, they should maybe pick up a copy of this and look at these stories and investigate some of these kinds of stories. Bear in mind that we actually investigated and vetted 203 stories this past, and then our judges winnowed and participants winnowed them down to the top 25. Those are all posted online as what we call validated independent news stories. So this is a big part of our effort for critical media literacy and education. People learn a lot in the process, and we also then get to get these kind of stories back out into the public for another round online in the book, so that people can say, hey, I missed that story. And even the people that, and we hear this all the time, even people that are somewhat news savvy, they'll take a look at our book and they'll say, huh, I pay attention to a lot of news media, and then they'll rattle off a few things that they know or that they listen to, or NPR or PBS, or maybe even Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! And then they'll go down the list and they'll say, but I never heard this story on media whitewashing the Senate CIA torture report, or they'll say, I have no idea what the NSA's Aurora Gold program is, or they'll say, I didn't realize that almost 90% of Pakistani drone victims were not identifiable as militants. There's always something on the list, and in fact, this was just covered in Business Insider yesterday. But our number one story this past year was based on an Oxfam study that got almost no attention outside of The Guardian in London. And Business Insider just picked it up the other day. By the way, there was no mention in the Business Insider article of the Oxfam report. It's interesting that they're talking about a similar issue, but not the actual report. And that's that 1% of the global population control over half of the global wealth. That's a stunning figure. It's gotten worse in the past 2 years, and it's slated to go to 60% in the next 2 years, where 1% of the global population will own 60% of the global wealth. And these are the kind of stories that people need to wrap their heads around to try to understand what's going on, both in domestic and global politics. And so people can understand that 40 years ago, middle-class families on, say, a teacher's salary or a firefighter's salary or a construction worker or mill worker salary could buy a home. And they could put their kids through college. That's no longer the case for most people. We live in a society where the CEO culture has seen their incomes increase by over 350%, while the working class has stagnated. In fact, adjusted for inflation, their dollars have decreased by 5% over the last 3 decades. So these are the kind of stories that people feel they understand, but if they're watching corporate news media, they don't hear these stories. So we think that these are significant, and again, that's why we have this list every year, that's why we put these in the book every year, is that we hope that it gets people thinking about them. And I can tell you firsthand, and a couple of the students that are here will tell you as well, and Peter can tell you, that when the students get a hold of these stories, we hear stories often about how the millennial generation is too busy with their thumbs and too plugged in and all this kind of thing, right? But the interesting thing is that we encounter these people all the time. I teach at Diablo Valley College. Peter's at Sonoma State University. Ken Burrows is at San Francisco State University. Nolan Higdon, who works with us, is at about 6 different colleges in the Bay Area, right, including a lot of community colleges. And guess what? You probably won't find this shocking. But young people actually care about things that are going on. And what's even more interesting is that they're pretty worried about the world that they're inheriting from the older generations. And when they get a hold of this information, they feel like, oh my, I suspected things were not going well, and now I understand why. And then they kind of turn on and they get really interested in that. And that's really what Project Censored has been about from its inception, is really trying to get information to the people and to encourage people to be self-empowered and to be the media, be citizen journalists, and participate in these narratives. So what I want to do now, again, I could talk a lot more about the contents of the book, but I'd rather talk more with you later on and have you all talk a little bit about what you're thinking. But before we do that, I want to bring up a couple people that have participated and contributed to this book, the Censored 2016 book. I want to start by bringing up Stephen Farrer from San Francisco State University that contributed to a fantastic story. And again, some of you may know about it, but this is the story: the oil industry illegally dumps fracking wastewater, including into California aquifers. So Stephen's going to come up and talk about that, and Crystal Bedford is going to come up after Stephen, and she's going to talk about some of the work that she's done with the project over the year. So thanks again for coming out, and Stephen, come on up.
Thank you very much. Okay. So what I found out was I initially found a report about how in 2014 the Center for Biological Diversity was reported that the oil industry in California had dumped about 3 billion gallons of wastewater into clean aquifers in California. And they showed that about 54% of these active wastewater sites were about 10 miles between these clean aquifers. Yeah. And what's more is that kind of what we have seen also is that these things have also activated different microseismic activity. So as you know, there's a lot of push towards fracking, and that this is kind of a done deal, that this is going to be a boon for our economy, and it has been. But and that also that water is quite a precious commodity in California, but these issues seem to kind of pass right on through. So I was struck by this article and kind of followed it a little bit deeper, and so I found it rather significant. Didn't see it covered very much, and so that's why I brought it to light. Was there?
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Excuse me. Yeah, well. Okay. Yeah, right. Yeah, so at first this was an international article that just kind of came up very briefly. I followed it a little bit, and like where did they get these articles, or where I wanted to dig deeper. So this was something that usually these articles come and we look kind of briefly at them, and I feel like that part of Project Censored on my part was to develop the sort of media literacy to find out where these sources come from, and to be able to find out for my own. I feel like the big part of what we are given in the media is to kind of take certain bullet points and then move on with our day and not really think critically about what this is. So for me, I looked a little bit deeper, even looked at the comment section under this, and you know, there was a big, the wastewater dumping ended in, I believe, in July of 2014. And when I looked at the comment section under these different articles, there was a lady who chimed in and said, hey, you know, this RT report was all wrong. I saw such and such. Hey, I retired and such, but along with a bunch of my other staff. Now, this was at the same time when it was found out that all this wastewater dumping was going on. So that's when I looked at like the Bakersfield local papers where she said that this article first came out. So it was part of that following up on it and being able to parse apart with the Center for Biological Diversity and the documents that were shown by the EPA that kind of showed the complicity between the EPA, the local environmental organizations, the state-run organizations that were in charge of gas and oil industry. So for me, I found it troubling to say the least, especially at a time when water seems to be such an important topic, and actually an important topic for California since California has been around. And I guess, you know, something that we learn about in history is like, oh, there's like, back in the day we did these horrible hydraulic mining for gold, and how, and you know, what a horrible thing that was. And I guess what I saw from some of the reports I read is really not that much has changed. That there's still a sense of that these resources can just kind of come and go for other people's profit, and that really doesn't have anything to do with the population that lives in California. So I'm glad that water is important in California, and this article was kind of an attempt to kind of push that issue forward a little bit more, to kind of highlight that. So anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Stephen, for your work. There were several stories on water in the book, and we've done several shows. Stephen's been on KPFA's radio show with us, talking about his story and his research. And again, it's a really, really important story. And again, people know that California's in a drought, but we don't always get to hear the significance of these stories or the depth of these stories. You know, there was one detail, by the way, from this was the #2 story in the book, by the way, that Stephen researched and vetted. It was published originally in Indy Bay, and it was on Russia Today. And actually, our friends in Berkeley, MapLight. If you don't know who MapLight is, you should check them out. Map, M-A-P, Light, L-I-G-H-T, Money and Politics Light, shining a light on money and politics. So it's a kind of a political economy organization, and what MapLight does is that they track money that's donated into political parties and campaigns and you know, candidates, and then they find out, well, what do these people do when they're in office? What bills do they put forward? What laws do they vote for? And how does it connect to their funding? And that was actually part of the story. So there was an effort in California in May of 2014 to have a moratorium on fracking. Some of you may remember it was SB 1132. And the senators who voted against the moratorium received 14 times more money in campaign contributions from the oil industry than those who voted for it. And in fact, MapLight figures show that senators voting no on the moratorium bill received on average $25,000 from oil and gas, while those voting yes received less than $2,000. This is the kind of thing that MapLight does, but they don't get enough coverage. You know, the work that MapLight does, just they don't get enough coverage for people to understand that connection. It's one thing to suspect that connection, it's another thing to be able to demonstrate it and prove it time and again, like following American Legislative Exchange Council or ALEC and these kinds of things, and the significant control and influence money has on the political process. So these are, again, the kind of stories you'll see in our book this year and sadly in previous years. I'd like to bring up the former president of the Project Censored Club at Diablo Valley College. She's now a student at UC Davis. This is Crystal Bedford, and she did a fantastic study on women in media with several other of our student interns, and she's going to talk a bit about her work with Project Censored. And thanks so much, Crystal, for coming out.
Thank you. Like Mickey said, I worked with several other women looking at media representation of women And my particular area that I looked at was feminism. And what you find with that is you see that oftentimes when you do have feminism it comes up in a way that's more news abuse or junk food news. It ends up being, are you a feminist or aren't you a feminist? Like asking these questions to celebrities. And then if you are a feminist, oh, why do you hate men? And are you the right kind of feminist? Or are you just a fake feminist that's like in it for the money? And if you aren't a feminist, then why do you hate women? And it stops really looking into feminism as anything more. It makes it a very shallow conversation that's going on. But that's the way that it's kind of designed to happen. And as I started looking more and more into feminism, it popped up in so many different areas that are important to everyday news. Black Lives Matter is a feminist organization. It was started with feminist principles. It was started by women. And the way that they organized it was with, feminist ideas in mind and a feminist kind of hierarchy. So the reason that you don't see one person that's in charge of the Black Lives Matter movement for the entire country is because they made it that way very specifically so it would not have the top-down hierarchy. And each of these different areas are going to have different people in control. And each of these different areas are going to make sure that the voices specific to that area are going to be the ones that are being brought forward. And what that turns into in corporate media is, where are the leaders? There's no leaders. But it turns out that there's a lot of different leaders all around. You're just not looking at them. They're just not what corporate media is led to think of as leaders. They don't have some kind of tag on their collar that says that they're like the general of Black Lives Matter and they're the ones that are in charge. And you saw that earlier this year with the Bernie Sanders Seattle incident that went down, where there were some people from Black Lives Matter Seattle that went ahead and interrupted one of Bernie Sanders' events that he had. And a lot of the corporate news media was asking people in the Black Lives Matter organization to denounce it. And nobody was able to denounce it because it wasn't theirs to denounce. It was Black Lives Matter Seattle that was doing it. They were the people that were in charge of it. They were the ones that made the decisions that for themselves this was what they were going to do. Personally, I think that it worked pretty well. There was a lot of attention given to it, and when you started listening to the things that the women were saying, it was a great moment, I think, for me. But that's the kind of things that you see, is they want one person to be at the head of this movement, but rather than having it just be a single person, there's multiple issues going on all around that are very specific to the location. So that's one particular example in corporate news media, but it kind of shows, I think, the depth that you can get when you start looking at feminist issues outside of this very black and white kind of look that media tends to give. It's not necessarily just something that is a political station. It can be a tool for organizing, a tool for, having leadership happen without having it be so very much, top down. And that's really pivotal in a lot of grassroots movement that we're seeing around a lot of different places. And so when you start to learn more about these things, you can see the effects that it has in many different places. One of the other things that I found out when I was doing my research that kind of stuck out for me, women are about 50% of unions at this point, and the trend is going so that women are soon going to be more than 50% of unions. And that historically, if you look at it, is something of note, because when unions were really big, women empowerment was kind of one of those issues that sent them in a different direction. But what you find is that women that are in unions, as far as pay and benefits and all of these other things, may be better off than women that have a college degree. So if you're in a union where you're working together with other people to fight for your benefits, your wages, all these different things, you're better off than if you're going on your own and you have a college degree. And that, I think, is something that speaks hugely to the idea of women getting together and working for their own benefits. Because what you see is feminists that are getting together, and it's decried as the media as this thing of like, oh, you don't have to all kind of get together and gang up to get what you want. If you are going to be successful, it should be just you being successful in this sort of CEO kind of way where you're breaking the glass ceiling and screw anybody else that is left behind. But, taking on these masculine traits of leadership. And what you see actually working for women as a whole is when you get together in things like unions, when you get together in things like feminist organizations, when you get together and you're not just looking out for one person, but you're looking at the broader kind of spectrum. And so when you look at it through that way, the unions for $15 an hour is a feminist movement. All of these different things become feminist movements, and it's not necessarily because it's something that only affects women, but it is something that affects women greatly. And it doesn't have to be that it affects them more than men, it doesn't have to be anything like that, but it affects them. And getting together is something that makes sense. So, I've had questions asked to me where it's this idea of, when are we not going to need feminism? But it's like, even in a perfect world, I would still see the need for feminism, because you're still going to want people to be getting together to talk about what their needs are together. If we had a perfect world and then we're like, okay, we got it, we don't need this anymore, that would be something that would send you backtracking, in my mind. So that's a really interesting thing, and it's again, something that corporate news media doesn't show. One of the things that I kind of love about the Project Censored book, because we have all these different chapters in it, is you start doing work and you're doing the work on your own and it gets into the book, and then when you actually get the book back, you can see it echoed in other places where other people are doing similar things. So I know I just recently got mine, and one of the things that stuck out to me was there's a chapter in the back that's Existence is Resistance, Women in Occupied Palestine and Kashmir. And so it's kind of echoing, again, the importance of women in these various different roles, where when you include them in conversations where they're often excluded, the conversation changes greatly. And that was something that I think everybody who was working in the project for, representation of women in media was seeing in various different ways, is how when you bring women in and you add them into the conversation shifts and it changes, and what actionably actually happens changes as well. So I know Ellie, who is now up in Reed College, was looking at the representation of women in politics, which obviously we've got Hillary in the limelight right now. That other Republican woman whose name I don't remember, handful of others, and those are sort of the people that corporate media highlights, but there's so much that they don't highlight as well. So for instance, the last time that the Republicans were all gung-ho on shutting down the government, the people that actually got together and broke that stalemate was a group of women from both parties. So while all of the men were coming up in front of the cameras and they were giving their statements about, how we're gonna stand our ground and all these other things, the women were doing the work behind the scenes, and none of it was covered by corporate news media. And unfortunately, that's not an oddity, we have considering that women are 51% of the population, the representation that we have in our government at all levels and the representation that we have in the media is completely dismal. And it's only really getting women into these positions that starts to change these conversations. So that's both in media, having people as editors, having people in control of the news stations, which, considering you've got 6 corporations that own 90% of the media and they're all owned by old rich white guys, there's not a lot of women's input there. So again, it's something where it's a really big topic, but it's a topic where you see the echoes around kind of everywhere as you start to go. And I think that that's something, as you start gaining media literacy, that you start to see is while they talk about all of these various different things as though they're completely separate, and history, if it's ever brought up, is something that is like 100, 200 years ago, completely disengaged from everything that's going on, absolutely no sequence of events that might have led to today. The reality is that both issues that are going on around you that may seem completely dissimilar, and history is echoed in pretty much everything that ends up in Project Censored books. So yeah, I've had a lot of fun doing all this sort of stuff, becoming more involved with Project Censored. One of the things that I kind of love about it the most is the service learning aspect of it, is the fact that instead of like doing all of this work and going around and yapping my friends' ears off about all of the tiny little details that I found out that I'm so excited about, and just having it dead on a teacher's desk, I get to be here and I get to talk to other people. I get to talk to you guys, I get to talk to other people on my campus, getting other people involved in service learning. And for me, that's kind of one of the best things, because it brings a purpose to the learning that a lot of the times is sort of disengaged. One of the things that I see as a college student a lot is you get people that have this idea that they have to go to college and do all of these various different things, and it's only once they've completed their degree, or once they have their career and they've got a little bit of time under their belt, or once, and the date kind of keeps on moving back further and further and further, the farther along you make progress, it's only then that you can actually make any kind of changes. And with Project Censored, and with having this be something that's so very focused on students, it really flies in the face of that you don't have to wait for somebody to hand you a piece of paper that says, oh, now you can officially change things. It's just really doing the work and getting out there and talking. And you don't need much at all to do that. So thank you all very much.
But this is what our students do. They do care about things. And Crystal, in fact, is in a chapter with several other groups, including Dissent Newswire, also Sue Udry, who now is the head of Bill of Rights Defense Committee, where Shahid Buttar used to be. He's now at EFF. Government Accountability Project, couple filmmakers in here. One film, Nuclear Savage, on the nuclear testing on the islands, Marshall Islands. Another documentary filmmaker on the children of Fukushima. And this is the chapter again that Crystal and the other students were in, who did this piece on women in media. Also, From a Woman's Point of View, which is a radio program in Florida, Arlene Engelhardt, Mary Glenny. This is a program that's almost entirely on women, from women, and is from women's perspectives. And we also had Race Forward and Color Lines in this one chapter called Media Democracy in Action. So there's a lot more in the Project Censored book than just the top 25 stories, and the students are involved in various stages of the book, not just in vetting the stories like you heard Stephen earlier. So right now I'd like to call up one of our filmmakers. Christopher Oscar worked with Doug Hecker to make Project Censored the movie, which is an award-winning documentary that came out a couple years ago. And Doug was a former student of Peter Phillips when he first got to Sonoma State, and Christopher Oscar met him with an intention of making this documentary film. So Christopher's going to talk a little bit about that, and also what he's working on with our students. He's working on trying to get students and film students to make sort of mini documentaries and news reports about the Project Censored stories. So here's Christopher Oscar.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Mickey. Cool. So I'm Christopher Oscar, as Mickey said, and I love Project Censored. I love everything about it. And everywhere around the world where we show the movie, people they just want to get a piece of this. They say, that's it. That's what's going to help to change humanity and help get us out of where we're at. So I'm here to kind of just give a few words as to kind of where we're at with Project Censored, the movie. We did the film festival circuit when we premiered the film in April 2013. That was a lot of fun, from Sonoma all the way to Madrid. Picked up some awards along the way, and it was really, really great to do that and to see people, how they react to the film and to the message. And I'm a big documentary junkie. I mean, I love documentary films. Problem with a lot of documentary films, though, is they kind of leave you feeling like helpless, like, wow, man, that's the end of that. That sucks, or whatever. I can never use a plastic spoon again, or whatever. But Project Censored, the vibe we get from the audience after they see it is just so positive, and it's so hopeful, and it's so uplifting. And that's because of the professors and the students and everyone who's involved in Project Censored. So big kudos to all you guys. I really appreciate that we're able to be a part of this. I'm also really excited tonight to announce that we're only 8 likes away from getting to 1,000 people liking our Facebook page, Project Censored the movie. So anyway, it's been the goal I've been working on for the past year. So anyone out there who's got an iPhone, pop on there right now, get on Facebook, and go to Project Censored the movie and like us, because I want to get to 1,000 before I get home. I live about 15 minutes away. So I want to see that when I get home. That'll make my night. So right now what we're working on with Project Censored the movie is we want to get back on having a platform to have it available as a download so you can watch it online, stream it, gift it to a friend, that kind of thing. So we're working with, we did have it up on a company called Yekra, but they don't do anything anymore with downloaded films or anything. So we're looking to try to get launched onto iTunes, Amazon, Hulu, and eventually Netflix and Vimeo on demand. So stay tuned for that. That's a work in progress right now. And the other thing, as Mickey mentioned to you, which I'm real passionate about, is taking Project Censored, the book, which has the list of the top 25 censored stories, and turn them into these short films. And I think that's a gold mine right there to get more awareness about what's going on with the issues at hand, more awareness about Project Censored. And these could be 2 to 3 minutes long, and they can be passed around on YouTube, on Project Censored's website, all over Facebook, everywhere. And kind of synchronistically, however you call that, we had a professor from the Sonoma, or a college teacher from the Santa Rosa JC at the Petaluma campus who came to one of our screenings, and his name is Brian, and his class came to see the film, and we started talking, and it turns out that he teaches multimedia film for his class. So his whole class was a lot of journalism students, and what they did is they would research the stories that would come out at the college paper and turn them into these short films. And I said, well, here's some great material for you right here, and I gave him a copy of the Project Censored book, and he loved it. And so what we did last year for the first time was we collaborated together, and he had his students kind of did exactly the way I kind of envisioned it in my mind, where they would watch the film. I came in and gave a talk about it, and then they all got a copy of the Project Censored book and the list of the top stories, and then they could choose which story they had most passion for, that they felt, these issues really touched them personally, because I wanted them to be issues that they could relate to, and they had the passion behind it to make these into short films. And so they picked out their stories, and then I came back around the class and met with all the students to kind of get an idea of how their story was going to be structured. Talked about interviewing the student who broke the story for the Project Censored class, the faculty advisor who was part of that actual story, who helped to vet the story and everything. Get those interviews, and then do a little montage on the actual issue at hand, what that story was. And so fast forward to the end of the semester, where my film partner Doug Hecker and I are sitting in the Santa Rosa JC Petaluma campus in the auditorium and watching all these films from these students, and it was just magical to watch that. And so that's kind of where we're at. Definitely want to get more of those films done, and that way we can just easily share them on YouTube, Project Censored, and get the word out. And then we'll probably even do something. I was thinking Hole in the Media Productions, which is my company with Doug that did Project Censored the movie, would offer like to the best one from the class, like a $100 certificate or something. Just kind of give them a little extra something, students, and give them some dough. So spread the word about Project Censored. We're 8 likes away from 1,000 on Project Censored the movie Facebook page. I mean, not even close to the Project Censored. You guys are at what, like 25, 35,000? 42,000? We got a long way to go to catch up to you guys, but we will. And support Project Censored too. I know you're going to mention it too, but I'll just give a plug. Lagunitas on October 27th, 5:30. Going to be an awesome bash fundraiser for Project Censored. You'll see me around town going around looking for donations do a live auction, a silent auction, raffle, stuff like that. So thank you very much, Mickey and Peter. Really appreciate you guys. Project Censored rocks. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks so much, Christopher. And we have copies of the film here, DVD, if you're interested, as well as our new book. And as you heard Christopher say, we'll be at Lagunitas Tuesday, October 27th, 5:30 for a big fundraiser. We hope you can come out for that. The final speaker, certainly last but not least at all, is the former director of Project Censored and president of Media Freedom Foundation, Peter Phillips. He is co-author of a chapter in the 2016 book. It's called 21st Century Fascism: Private Military Companies in Service to the Transnational Capitalist Class. And I mentioned earlier, this is something that Peter's been researching for a very, very long time. This subject is sort of the 1%, right? He did his dissertation on the Bohemian Grove and the Bohemian Club of San Francisco. He's published numerous pieces over the years on the transnational capitalist class. And this year, really took it to another level and looks at this group. We've really moved beyond sovereign nations, basically. And we're really entering an era in the 21st century of transnational capitalist sort of overlords, or as Peter Dale Scott calls them, Wall Street overlords. And Peter talks about these mercenary armies, and it's not just Blackwater. Many people have heard of Blackwater. But Peter really delved into this area of research where very little has been done. And so I think it's really groundbreaking work. It certainly belongs in the Project Censored book, and more people should really know more about it. And Peter's going to come up now, and he's going to talk about his research. So, everybody, Peter Phillips.
Thank you. I'll share a little bit of the readings in Chapter 8 in our censored book. I want to thank Ray McClintock, Melissa Caneros, and Jacob Crabtree, who were my 3 students last year, graduating seniors who did the research on the private mercenary companies. So we found out who they were, the biggest ones, who's on their boards, what kind of contracts they've had, and so we put this in the context of what we call 21st century fascism: private military companies in service to the transnational corporate class, which is the global 1%. So globalization of trade and central banking has propelled private corporations to positions of power and control never before seen in human history. Under advanced capitalism, the structural demands for return on investment require an unending expansion of centralized capital in the hands of fewer and fewer people. The financial center of global capital is so highly concentrated that less than a few thousand people dominate and control $100 trillion worth of wealth. That's one thing to say that the top 1% owns half the world, which they do. But they don't do the management of it. I mean, many of these millionaires and billionaires, they just literally turn their money over to these massive market investment companies like BlackRock and Barclays Bank. And they're the ones that are making the decisions of how this money is going to be invested. So these few thousand people that control $100 trillion worth of wealth in the world, at the same time, half the world's population lives on less than $3 a day. And every day, 40,000 people die from malnutrition and easily curable diseases. So this gross inequality is what Professor William Robinson from UC Santa Barbara calls the crisis of humanity, as a book by that title. The world literally faces a new dark age of neo-feudal corporate totalitarianism, unlike anything we've previously known. The few thousand people controlling global capital amount to less than 1,000th of 1% of the world's population. They are the transnational capitalist class, the TCC. These are the capitalist elite of the world. They dominate nation states through international treaty agreements, transnational state organizations such as the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund. They communicate their policy requirements through global networks such as the G7, the G20, and various non-governmental policy organizations such as the World Economic Forum, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberger Group, Davos meetings. They are the ones that represent the interests of hundreds of thousands of millionaires and billionaires. The TCC are keenly aware of their elite status and their increasing vulnerabilities to democracy movements and unrest from the 99%. The military empire, dominated by the United States and NATO, serves to protect TCC investments around the world. That's the purpose of it. Wars, regime changes, occupations, performed in service of empire support to investors' access to natural resources and speculative advantage in the marketplace worldwide. Now, when the empire is slow to perform or faced with political resistance from new wars, private security groups and private military companies increasingly fulfill the TCC demands for protection of their assets. These protection services include personal security for TCC executives and their families, protection of safe residential and work zones, tactical military advising and training of national police and armed forces, intelligence gathering on democracy movements and opposition groups, weapons acquisitions, and even assassinations. One of the best known of these was, of course, Blackwater, founded in 1997 by Eric Prince. He was an ex-Navy SEAL. The company was established to provide a top-level training for U.S. military and law enforcement. Their training center was 7,000 acres of swampland on the border of North Carolina and Virginia. And they got their first big contract after the bombing of the USS Cole in October of 2000. They opened their training center in 2001. They had indoor and outdoor shooting ranges. They're still around. They got into a lot of trouble. They were awarded a big contract in Iraq in 2006. DynCorp, Blackwater, and Triple Canopy got to do the diplomatic security services in Iraq. They hired an unprecedented number of guns and security people for working at that purpose. Their most notorious event was Blackwater took place at Nasser Square in Baghdad on September 16, 2007, when Blackwater employees killed 17 Iraqi citizens. In October 2014, a U.S. federal court found that the deaths were not a battlefield tragedy, but the results of criminal acts, and the court convicted 4 Blackwater guards on charges of murder, manslaughter, and using a machine gun in a public place. All of them faced several decades of imprisonment. Following that incident, however, Blackwater began a process of restructuring its image. They changed their name to Blackwater Worldwide, altered their logo, started shifting away resources from security contracting. In 2009, Blackwater changed its name yet to Z Corporations, another round of restructuring. The company instituted a new management system, created a compliance and government program, assembled a leadership team with deep experiences in crisis management. They ended up being merged with Triple Canopy in 2004, and now are part of a group called Constellus Holdings. It's the leading provider of security, support, and advisory services to the U.S. government. It included Triple Canopy, Blackwater, and several other smaller security companies, Tidewater, National Strategic Protective Services. So all of Constellus's group contacts, including Blackwater, Triple Canopy, remain officially separate, but they're all under this one holding company umbrella. And they're all able to use each other's facilities. So all these different companies can use Blackwater's facilities in North Carolina for training. They're run by an all-male board. Red McCombs is the chair of the board. He's worth $1.7 billion, ranks number 1,054 on the Forbes World Billionaire list. He's the owner of the Minnesota Vikings, the Denver Nuggets, the San Antonio Spurs, and he's a co-founder of Clear Channel. Also on the board is John Ashcroft, former Attorney General under George Bush, one of the driving forces of war on terror after 9/11. The board also includes Admiral Bobby Emman to finance managers and leading Democratic advisors, a chief of staff to Vice President Gore, 93 to 95, and later a counselor to Clinton, Ted Catless. We studied 6 companies. The largest is G4S. G4S is a British company that employs 625,000 employees. The only company that's bigger in terms of employees is Walmart. So they operate around the world. G4S does security guards, alarms, management of cash and valuables, prison management, electronic monitoring of felons in 120 countries. They have an annual revenue of over 10 billion, operates in what they call complex environments, and they accept jobs that national armies will not do. In Nigeria, Chevron contracts with G4S for counterinsurgency operations and fast response mercenaries. G4S to undertake similar operations in the South Sudan, provides surveillance equipment for checkpoints and prisons in Israel, and security for Jewish settlements in Palestine. The G4S group has been invested in by the transnational corporate class. 9 of the top 13 financial management companies have invested in G4S. So this was a clear indication that the transnational class is very aware of the needs and the importance of private security. We reviewed DynCorp and several others, and that's all part of the chapter, but it leads to this idea that the transnational class is very concerned about security. And what William Robinson talks about in his Crisis of Humanity book, Global Capitalism, a whole chapter on policing of global capitalism in the 21st century, and he's the one that uses the word fascism. He hypothesized that the continuing concentration of capital and massive poverty will lead to nation states facing legitimation crises that require them to employ a vast host of coercive control mechanisms, mass incarcerations, various levels of martial law, increased separation of classes into restricted geographical zones. Private mercenary companies will play an essential role in the enforcement of this future neo-fascist capitalist world that Robinson foresees. Capital would be free to travel instantly and internationally to anywhere that profits are possible, while nation states would become little more than population containment zones with increasingly repressive labor controls. Estimates are that over 200 billion is spent on private security globally, with annual expenditures anticipated to be even higher. 15 million people are involved worldwide in the security business in some one aspect or another. Now, these companies offer a full range of services. They're a part of the transnational class. They're almost exclusively male in terms of their board management, and they represent some of the most powerfully connected people in the world, with numbers of socio-political interlocks to government, military, finance, and policy groups. So this trend towards privatization is a serious threat to human rights and due process, democratic transparency and accountability. It's not going to be on the agenda for the democratic debates which are happening tonight. It's not talked about. The U.S. NATO empire sets the moral standards for denial of human rights by using pilotless drones to kill civilians without regard for international law in various regions of resistance and empire, labeling the dead civilians as insurgents and terrorists. The complete lack of due process, human rights belies any standard of government moral legitimacy. This lack of moral legitimacy in turn sets standards for private military companies to operate with much the same malice in the shadow of empire. This isn't just happening over there. All of this is developing and maturing and will be very much part of our way of life if we don't really engage in some way to do something about this. So the 99% of us without wealth and police power face a looming threat of overt repression and complete loss of human rights and legal protections. We see signs of this daily with police killings, over 100 a month now, warrantless electronic spying, mass incarcerations, random traffic stops, airport no-fly lists. and Homeland Security compilation of databases on suspected radicals. So that's not the world that most of us want to see, and it's time that we stand up. If we have humanitarian values, to talk about these issues, to address them openly, and to speak as loudly and openly as we can. Thank you.
Everybody, we're going to conclude the evening here, but I wanted to thank all of the speakers. And certainly, it's these kinds of things that the news media are supposed to be covering, at least under First Amendment free press principles, but they are not. And I guarantee that those of you that came here probably heard more than anybody tuning into the Democratic debates, as Peter just mentioned a moment ago. And I want to conclude kind of where we left off, where we began the evening, which was, well, actually, this is where we left off with Peter, and then we began the evening with Carl Jensen, the founder of Project Censored. And Carl wrote that when he started the project in 1976, he developed an alternative definition of censorship. And rather than starting with the source of censorship as traditionally defined, with the obligation of an elite to protect the masses, right, saying, well, the people don't need to know these things, we need to protect them from this information. Carl Jensen, in the definition of Project Censored, the definition of censorship starts at the other end, with the failure of information to reach the people. For the purposes of the project, censorship is defined as suppression of information, whether purposeful or not, by any method, including bias, omission, underreporting, or self-censorship, which prevents the public from fully knowing what is happening in the world. And the many things that we talked about here this evening are things that people are being prevented from hearing and knowing about. And as Project Censored enters its 40th year, we are proud to announce a new partnership with the ACME Coalition for Media Education, the Action Coalition for Media Education, that's ACME, smartmediaeducation.net, along with Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. They have the first graduate program in digital media literacy and digital culture. And we're working with the people at ACME and Sacred Heart University with our affiliate Professor Nolan Higdon, ACME's Rob Williams, Julie Frechette, Sacred Heart University's Bill Usman and Lori Bindig. We're working with students across the country on 20 campuses. And we're working on this global critical media literacy project. We right now have an educator's resource guide, and it's an invitation to get more people involved in this kind of media democracy, or what we call media democracy in action. So please visit projectcensored.org to learn more. And if you tune into the Project Censored show this Friday on KPFA at 1 o'clock Pacific time, Peter and I will be talking about the Global Critical Media Literacy Project with all of these people. And this is really one of our next endeavors, and we really see this as sort of the next step for Project Censored, and really taking Carl Jensen's mission, growing it like we did through Peter with so many books, and now on 20 campuses. And Andy Roth and I are now looking and working with these other civic organizations, nonprofit organizations, and higher education institutions to really do what George Seldes in the 20th century, the great journalist, said, to do what the job of journalism is, and that's to tell the people what's really going on. So thanks so much for coming out this evening, and we'd certainly like to hear if you have any comments or questions. Thanks again for coming. Anybody? Comments, questions? Oh, yeah, Mark.
So with the advent of the internet, is there possibilities of us breaking the back of Fox News, CNN?
Actually, the corporate media viewership has declined steadily over the last 5 years. And so people are turning off some of the corporate news media. But there still are millions of people watching, right, these messages. And as you heard Crystal say, six corporations control 90% of that media. But the bigger question we get asked then is like, okay, well, I kind of get that we're not getting the news. I think news, confidence in corporate news among the American public, according to a recent Pew poll, is down to about 40%. It's about as low as it's been. But the question we often get asked is, well, who do you trust, right? Or where do you get news? People are really accustomed and conditioned and trained to kind of go home and push the red button and have it beamed into the living room kind of thing. And what we do is we try to teach media literacy and critical thinking. That means you have to actively pursue the information. You have to go find it. You have to question sources. You have to ask questions. You have to bring these issues up in your communities, your families, and in the society at large. And share what you find to be transparently sourced, factual reports or broadcasting institutions or publications and share them with people. And that's really what Project Censored has been about from the beginning. And it's also about broadening the definition of censorship. You know, Project Censored is also part of the National Coalition Against Censorship and Books Week and so on. And you know, we have very broad definitions of censorship. And the news media, you know, they're very sophisticated at propaganda and winnowing information. And I think that when you mention the internet, the more people, you know, use the internet intelligently from a critical media literacy mindset and with critical thinking skills, there's plenty of things to find. A lot of the stuff on the internet is not so great, right? But it's still there. And that's why the corporate powers that be are trying to shut down net neutrality. That's why the Trans-Pacific Partnership is happening. It's for to strangle intellectual property rights issues. It's to shut down media diversity, right? And that's why we write about these things and we show there's reasons that these stories are underreported. That's because they're really designed to destroy democratic people's movements and bottom-up governance. And the antidote to that is, again, critical thinking and participatory democracy. So we urge people to turn off corporate media, to be the media, and to share other sources of information with people. So we think we live in interesting times where because of the internet, things are better, but maybe also worse, depending upon what people bring to it. But it's certainly a hopeful kind of technology. In fact, even when Peter took over the project almost 20 years ago, you know, it's still getting hundreds of magazines and newspapers and print journals and stuff going into Sonoma State University. Now, I mean, most of that stuff's all online. So the internet is a powerful resource. Social media can be very powerful. It can also be powerfully distracting. So it's just how we use the technology. And media literacy is about how to use the technology for more democratic self-governance. So. Others? Anyone? No? Well, thanks for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Please feel free to pick up a movie, pick up a book, and we will see you next month at Aquas here in Petaluma, where we'll have Peter Byrne talking about his new investigative report on breast cancer. It's called Busted. In fact, it's an interesting report about inflated numbers of breast cancer, about sort of an increase in breast cancer as related to the healthcare profession itself. It's actually a pretty riveting story that kind of flips a lot of what we think and know about breast cancer research, the media phenomenon, the pink washing, and so forth. So Peter Byrne will be here. We'll have a couple other folks, and we're going to be talking about that issue next month. So we hope to see you here. Peter Phillips and I did a show on that actually several months ago. If you go to projectcensored.org, you can hear the interview with Peter Burns. He has updated news for you, and he'll be bringing that to you the second Tuesday of November. And we'll finish the Project Censored series this year in December with Michael Negler, Stephanie Van Hook, and the Meta Center for Nonviolence. So thanks again for coming, and we'll see you next time.